My name is Dusty Small. I'm a church planter and the lead pastor of Purpose Church in Bossier City, Louisiana. The topic that I want to share with you today is one of the more eye-opening teachings that I do in premarital counsel with young couples that are committing to a lifelong marriage. The nature of this teaching here, though, is going to be more informative than responsive. In counseling in the premarital area, informative tells us more about who we are, and then the responsive side is the follow-up to what do I do with what I just learned. And so the title of this teaching is Invisible Baggage and Its Weight on Marriage. 13 years ago, my wife and I were just married. Pastor Bethel Johnson let us rent a portion of his home in Waltham, Massachusetts. Now, this was the first home that we had lived in. It was a huge blessing for us. I was still in Bible college. My wife had just graduated and we were starting to serve there at IPAB there in Waltham, Massachusetts. We were beginning a journey to know and learn what it meant to be married. Now, during the first 2 years of our marriage, my wife and I, we moved 3 different times. I was from Indiana. My wife was from New York City. I had to pack up all of my belongings and drive all the way out to New York City, then load everything she had up in a U-Haul, and then we drove over to Waltham and we moved into our very first home there. Well, a year later, we moved from Waltham to North Chelmsford. And then another year later, we moved from North Chelmsford, Massachusetts, all the way down to Waxahachie, Texas. As you can imagine, I became quite familiar with boxing, packing, and loading things up. I hauled my baggage around the nation, you might say. And I believe that I learned a great lesson that I like to pass on to others about marriage from this. And so I want to say right here, what does all this really have to do with our teaching today? And I think I can begin by introducing an old King James phrase that many of us are familiar with, and that is to leave and cleave. Now, most translations that we're familiar with today usually use the word unite or join together for the word cleave. Our text in this lesson is going to come from the beginning in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. And the Bible says this: "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united or cleave to his wife, and they will become one flesh." Now, the word cleave means to adhere firmly and closely, or you might say be joined to form one. So what we see here is God's divine design for marriage. Now, what I want to share with you is what I believe to be paramount and deeply critical to ensure that your marriage overcomes what I'm calling invisible baggage and its weight on marriage. You see, like a jam-packed U-Haul, we can accumulate things that affect our union with our spouse. I mean, imagine with me for just a moment. Imagine trying to hug your loved one. You got your arms out, you're ready to embrace, but there was a large piece of furniture between you and her. And no matter how close you wanted to get, that furniture that is between you is creating a barrier that is keeping you from adhering or being joined together. Or imagine it like this. Imagine having 2 pieces of sticky tape, but then sprinkling dirt all over those pieces of tape. Now, they might still be a little bit sticky, but they're not going to adhere as firmly and closely as they should if all of the dirt wasn't there. And I think this will help us to gain a clearer picture of how invisible baggage can keep us from adhering or being joined together, or as we use that King James phrase, to cleave with our spouse. So let's talk a little bit about invisible baggage. Often what I have seen is that the invisible baggage really deals with expectations and experiences. Now, it's not limited to this, and I'll talk a little bit more about another topic that falls into this category of invisible baggage. But expectations and experiences, the thing is, we all have them. Some are good and some are bad. But the weight of our expectations can affect our psyche and our emotions. And they, get this, they may not be packed up in a brown box or in a container that you bought at the store, but they are packed up and taken with you wherever you go. Then sometimes these things that we packed up and took with us can trigger our mind, it can trigger emotions, and it has a great effect on our marriages. So that's a little bit about expectations and experiences, and we're going to unpack that, if you will, here a little later. The other part about invisible baggage is trauma. Now, there is a whole lot that could be said specifically about trauma, but what I want to briefly say for us today is that trauma shapes how we view and live life. It shapes how you and I process information. It shapes how we think about others, and it shapes how we think about ourselves. Ultimately, trauma creates emotional reactions such as anger, anxiety, abuse, addiction, fear, panic, and a host of other emotions that can ultimately become life-controlling. Now, let's break down and talk a little bit about life context. Now, life context is important when you're talking about premarital counseling, you're talking about my life, your life, because life context is going to shape my experiences and my expectations, which ultimately, as I've already stated, becomes the invisible baggage that can weigh down our marriages and it can keep us from adhering closely, or it can be that furniture that's in between you and your spouse. And so identifying these things is truly going to help overcome those obstacles that might trip you up down the road. So life context, this is what shapes our experiences and our expectations. It's how you were raised, the environment that you grew up in. Your life experiences ultimately will begin to shape your life context. So what I've learned in this is that it becomes the link to the level of trauma that you may have experienced growing up. Now, a few major components to what shapes our life context, and we'll just briefly cover these for our teaching today, is family, friends, faith, and finances. Now, there are other things that shape your life context, but these are some of the big hitters that affect all of us in a very strong way. So let's talk about family first. This is usually the biggest component to the invisible baggage that I pick up throughout my life. So some things that you maybe would want to consider with your family and how it might affect you down the road is, were both parents in your home as you grew up? Now, if only one parent was there, you're going to have a picture of marriage based on what it was like growing up with only one parent in the home. Was dad gone often? Were your parents divorced, or were you a part of a blended family? Did you have maybe stepbrothers or sisters? That is all going to shape your life context as it relates to your family. Well, in your family, was there maybe physical or verbal abuse? These kind of things can create trauma and shape your context. I want to give us kind of a simple and maybe a funny illustration to help understand how family can shape our life context. Some of you may have heard the story about a ham illustration. So one Christmas, Mom and her daughter were in the home and they were preparing the ham for a Christmas dinner, and the mom cut the ends of the ham off and she put it in the pan, and the daughter was quite inquisitive, and she asked her mom, why do you cut the ends of the ham off before you put it in your pan? The mom was actually taken back a little bit. She said, that's just what your grandma always did, and maybe it helps to soak up the juices. And so the little girl wasn't just pausing there and accepting, yeah, that's what it is. She decides to pick up the phone and she calls her grandma. She says, hey, grandma, hey, we're here making a ham, and mom told me that this is what you always did. You cut the ends of the ham off. Is that because you thought it might soak up the juices? And the grandma just chuckled a little bit and she said, no, actually, I did that because that's what my mom did. So the girl gets off the phone with her grandma and she calls her great-grandma. Hey, great-grandma, Mom and I are cooking a ham for Christmas, and I just really wanted to know. She said her mom cut off the ends of the ham, and her mom says you cut off the ends of the ham, and we're wondering, is that all because it soaks up the juices better? What's the point of all that? And the great-grandma really started laughing, and she says, we never had a pan big enough to fit the ham in it. So I had to cut the ends of the ham off for it to fit in the pan to be placed in the oven. The two of them just laughed together because they couldn't quite put their mind around how they were still doing this when we had pans big enough to put the ham in it. Now, this is quite funny, but it also shows us how we reproduce what we are taught. Or we might say it like, what we witness in the home is often what perpetuates from generation to generation. That's just how we did it. So what do? We continue to do this very thing. Let me bring up another one that even in my marriage we found to be a little difficult to traverse, and that's holidays and the expectations that surround these big events for families. Now, you and your spouse may have some expectations of what that may be. How did your spouse, grow up celebrating Christmas? Or how did your spouse grow up celebrating Thanksgiving? These are usually two big holidays, and so what did your families do? You might even throw in, what are your parents' expectations of you for Christmas or Thanksgiving? Does your parents expect you to come back home? Or will her parents expect you to come visit them for the holidays? Some of the challenges for this might be when your family lives in New York City and you're living in Texas, and then you have other parents that are living in Indiana. This is something that my wife and I had to work through. That distance created some challenges for us, and we had to figure out how to navigate that. The next area of life context that we want to talk about is friends. Did you have close friends or not growing up? Did your family move a lot maybe and make it hard for developing depth in relationships? These things can ultimately have an impact on your relationships in your marriage and how you view marriages. Another big one is faith. Yes or no? Do you have faith? Do you not have faith? Does your spouse have faith? Does she not have faith? What about their family? Where is their faith? All of those things can ultimately affect us. Another question you might ask about faith, well, if you did have faith, or if your spouse has faith, was it a priority? What did worship look like as a family? Was there times of family prayer? Was it maybe just, yes, we were believers, but we really didn't make it a matter of priority? That's going to affect how things happen in marriage. Are you and your future spouse aligned biblically and spiritually? That's always a priority to ask in premarital counseling. Yes, we know that the scriptures say that we should not be unequally yoked, but often in premarital counseling, you might find a couple that hasn't really thought through that. They've just fallen in love and they don't realize how this is going to play a key factor in their marriage down the road. Another one that we talk about here is finances. So finances is just as big as any other topics that we talk about in life context. So growing up, were finances real tight for you, or was there plenty of money and it was never an issue? Sometimes if finances were tight, well, how tight were they? Growing up, did you ever miss a meal? Were the utilities ever turned off? Were your family members really tight with money, or were they just haphazard with their spending? These things will ultimately shape how you view money in your marriage. Another big question I'll ask couples when they come in is, do you plan to have a joint bank account? Sometimes couples want to have separate bank accounts, and from my angle, I don't always advise this because of the idea of cleaving. I want couples to truly be in unity and learn to work together totally. Anything that might be hers and his, in my mind, as I look at it from a biblical worldview, doesn't really capture the idea of cleaving and becoming one. Because I believe the scriptures teach that we are to become one, and what's mine is hers and what's hers is mine, and we learn to work together as helpmates for one another. So these things are important when we talk about shaping our life context. Here's some more. Was your family in debt? Were there arguments over money? Who managed the finances? Who's going to manage the finances in your marriage? Were you taught about money stewardship? Again, all of this shapes the life context and can become invisible baggage and its weight on marriage as you pack up and move in to your family and home together. Now I'm going to move into the area of trauma. And so before I go any further, I just want to note that all of us, no matter how great you think your family was, there is some level of dysfunction in our families that can create some trauma as we grow up and become invisible baggage. So again, no matter how great you think your family was, there's no perfect family. Now, throughout the years, I was conditioned to think that the only people who ever experienced trauma or any type of PTSD were those who fought in wars or dealt with violence, experienced some sort of disaster or shocking death. These were the people that really had trauma or PTSD. Then I got a few years into ministry and I began to realize that trauma goes much further than just those who fought in a war or had some really tragic things. I began to learn about my childhood and the effects of trauma on my life. And I came to realize that those who have experienced trauma are at a much higher risk of developing addiction or substance abuse disorders. Now I want to break down a little bit on what trauma is and what it looks like. So most often we kind of define trauma in two categories. We call it the big T trauma or little t trauma. Now, big T trauma are the more serious things that we would picture. That's a family member gets diagnosed with a disease, or maybe there was a very significant death in your family, or you witnessed a death, or it could have been physical or sexual harm, and there's a lot of other things that might fall into this category. Then there's the little t trauma. Now, little t trauma is like betrayal, bullying, harassment, verbal and emotional abuse. Now, both types of trauma can cause deep psychological and emotional wounds, and they need to be taken seriously. So generally speaking, when we look at this, we don't want to emphasize one over the other, but we do want to know that both of them are very serious. And as we look a little deeper into this now on big T, little t trauma, I want to talk, generally speaking, about two types of needs that we had growing up and kind of shift back into how the life context of family plays such a huge role in the invisible baggage and the weight it can have on marriage. So generally speaking, two types of needs that we have growing up are love and security. Now, love is affection, attention, affirmation, and the security is just, was your home safe? Was it a trusting place for you? Now, growing up, we need the pendulum to swing both ways. We need both love and security. We can't just have one. We really need both. But I want to show you how when the pendulum only swings one way, and maybe you only had love, the attention, affirmation, and affection, but there wasn't a safe place that you grew up in, or you didn't have trust in where you grew up. And I want to show you how it can affect our marriages. So often I found in counseling, there's a lot of minimizing. You might hear things like, I had a great childhood growing up. My parents didn't beat me or anything like that. And they just associate, hey, I had a great childhood because I wasn't abused. But what they don't understand about this is that you don't have to experience verbal abuse or to have been beaten to experience trauma in your own personal life. So let's look at the security part on this. So someone may say that their father was a provider. Their home was safe. Their father provided for them. He always gave us what we needed. Home was safe. But the father wasn't really the affirming part. The love was absent. And so the attention, affirmation, and affection wasn't there. So what happens is, while the father was a provider and the home was safe, that child grew up missing a great part of what should happen in a home. And it affects their development, it affects their relationship, and ultimately it pours over into the marriage. So how we are loved is often how we love in return. If the home is missing love, you're missing the other pendulum to basic needs when growing up. Maybe you had that safe environment where the father was providing, and you were that person that didn't experience that love and affirmation. And sometimes that affects how you love your spouse. But then sometimes it's the other way, and your home really wasn't a safe place, and there was verbal abuse. Maybe there was constant criticism, ridiculing, blaming, belittling. Some parents can be overly critical, or there's also the helicopter parents that are there, and that affects a child growing up. And so I want to conclude here with an example of kind of how this comes together and tell you a little story of what happened in my marriage with my wife. Around the house, I'm generally the one that takes the trash out. I help clean and do those kind of things. And one day, I was taking out the trash, and I took the lid off the trash can and I just dropped it. And it happened to land just right, so it kind of popped on the floor. And immediately my wife was standing right there, and she looked up at me and jumped and said, "What'd you do that for?" And I had no clue why she was responding that way or what was going on. But later on, when we had more informative counseling, we began to discover and talk more in depth about the environment that we grew up in. So she grew up in an environment where there was verbal abuse, there was physical abuse, there was things that shaped what she was going to bring into the marriage. And when I dropped that trash can lid, it triggered a past experience where there might have been things that were thrown in her home. And that created a moment to where it startled her and it affected us. Now, had we never dug deeper, I would have thought, man, I really did something wrong. And we could have got into an argument over that on, I didn't do anything, why are you yelling at me type thing. And that's just a little story of how something so little can become so big. And this ultimately becomes the invisible baggage and its weight on a marriage. So I close with just reminding you, this is just simply some things that are more informative. The next step is taking the quality assessment for your individual life, and then you begin to analyze your own individual context. And then ultimately, I would encourage you want to seek godly, responsive counseling, because some areas can be handled adequately in your premarital counseling, but others, you really need to work with a professional who's trained in the areas of teaching you how to respond to the things you begin to learn about yourself. Hope this has been helpful, and thank you for watching today.